Routing in general decides the path and sequence of operations to be performed on job from one machine to another. The purpose of routing is to establish the optimum sequence of operation so that the manufacture of the finished item is performed at the lowest cost and the fastest time. Hi guys, today I Bhavita welcome you to the session on Angular routing. But before we get started, let us look into the agenda for today. We're going to begin the session by looking at and discussing about some of the developer tools and guidelines used in Angular. Further, we understand why we need routing in Angular and then study about routing and navigation in Angular, discuss about some of the common routing tasks. Next, we'll move on single page application routing techniques. And finally, we have router references to touch upon and then get into the hands-on part with a demonstration. So before we get started, make sure you're subscribed to Edureka YouTube channel. Also, to stay updated about the most trending technologies, hit the notification bell. Now, if you're looking for an online training certification, do check out the link given in the description box below. Angular is used by over 40% of front-end developers. Given its widespread popularity, it is always a good idea to know a few of the best practices before we get started with our coding. With that said, let's take a brief look at a few. Angular CLI. When designing apps with Angular, it is one of the most powerful accessibility tools available. Angular CLI makes it simple to build an application with adhering to best practices. Now, basically, it is a command line interface tool for initializing, developing, scaffolding, maintaining, testing, and even debugging your Angular applications. Next, we have file structure conventions. As you know, maintainability and readability are greatly aided by naming conventions, which basically will help you give consistent manner to locate stuff briefly. Now, within the project, consistency is critical since it aids significant efficiency. Hence, it is highly advisable to maintain a good filing and folder system. Style vocabulary. Each guideline explains a good or harmful practices. They're all presented in the same way. So basically, a strength of each recommendation is indicated by the phrasing of each guideline. Now, there are vocabularies such as do, consider, avoid, and you can even use while in case of questions for vocabularies. So, usage of these vocabularies actually make the coding style more efficient. TypeScript, as you already know, for Angular application development, TypeScript is the primary language. It's a subset of JavaScript with type safety and tooling support at design time. JavaScript was basically replaced by TypeScript while the Angular versions kept upgrading. Hence, using it will increase your coding compatibility. Single responsibility. It's crucial not to have several components, services, directives. It will actually burden your coding style. So, do not have all of this in a single file. Every file should actually be in charge of only one function. We keep our files tidy, readable, and maintained by doing so. Now, component structures. If you have a piece of UI that you need in multiple places throughout your application, create a component out of it and use it. Actually, this will save you a lot of time if UI needs to be altered for whatever reasons. Now, you don't have to go around updating UI code everywhere in such instance. Instead, you can actually change the code in that component itself. So this way your component structure comes in handy. We have lazy loading. So whenever feasible, lazy load modules in Angular applications. Basically with this, when something is loaded slowly, it is only loaded when it is needed. So by avoiding the useless modules, the size of the application load initial time will be reduced and the application boot time will be improved. Documentation. As you already know, that documentation helps and comes in handy in many places. Make sure to document the code as much as possible. It will assist a new developer in understanding the logic and readability of a project. Now, documenting each variable and procedure is a good idea. Methods must be defined using multi-line comments that indicate what task the method actually does. Again, this goes the same with all the parameters, etc. Now, again, there are some more developer guidelines like naming conventions or directive selectors, unit test file names, application structure, ng modules. Some of them will actually come across as in when we start coding. Now let's move ahead and take a look at why we need routing in Angular. So basically, Angular routing is nothing but a technique for directing users to appropriate web page so they can complete their tasks. In other words, you can say a single Angular application may contain several components. Now, as you can see here, there are multiple components which actually comprises of a Angular application. Now, understanding some more needs of using routing and navigation, it's basically that if you enter a URL in address bar for corresponding page, it will navigate to the corresponding browser. Now again, clicking links on page, the browser navigates to new page, and browser navigates backward and forward throughout the history of pages as you may wish. With that said, let's understand and learn more about routing and navigation. So, what is routing in Angular basically? Routing is the process of partitioning an application's UI using URLs. And it's very essential functionality for every front-end framework. It enables programmers to create modern single-page applications with numerous views that may be loaded once by a browser. Now, once a browser is loaded, a single-page application should be viewed in different and numerous ways. And routing comes in handy with that. So let me give you some instance of actions that user do while browsing through an application. Now it could be like you type a URL into address bar, the browser will take you to appropriate page. Or the browser navigates to new page when you click links on page. It can also be like browser navigates backward and forward throughout history pages, like I mentioned before. Now, this is where Angular routing enables navigation from one view to another. And this can be done to perform user tasks. Adding on, routing actually allows to display specific views of your application depending on your URL path. To add this functionality to your sample application, you need to update the app. As you can see here, there are two views. Each view has specific URLs, which is associated with each of the views. As in when the application is updated, the views associated to the URL is displayed. Now with all that said, we shall take a look at the architecture or the life cycle of our routing and navigation as to how it takes place. To start with, there are 5 major operations for Angular routing. When Angular router receives a URL, it does first task. That is apply redirects, or as you can see here, URL redirects the applied. This means when the user clicks on a link or updates the location bar directly, the router receives a URL. So the router's initial action with this URL is to apply any redirections. Next, we move on to the statuses of router. So the first step in statuses is recognizing status of a router. The router here will actually use URL to generate a router state. Now to comprehend how does this step works, we must first comprehend how router matches the URL. So that's where the third step comes into picture, executing guards and data resolutions, or process guards and resolvers. We currently have a future router state. Now, the router will then verify that switching to the new state is permissible. So with this, we will accomplish using running guards. Now, we suffice it to say that guard is a router function that ensures that navigation to a specific URL which is permitted is occurred. Coming to the fourth step, that is activate view user router outlet, which means it enables all required components here. The router can now activate this mode by bringing up all of the required components and plugging them into proper router sockets. Now, this will take us to the fifth step, the final step, which will navigate and update browser's location. So, the router has constructed a router state and it has also instantiated the components at this stage, right? After that, what we must be able to do is we must be able to move from one router state to another. Now there are two ways to do this. The first way is imperatively using router navigate function, or we have another way, that is declaratively using router link directive. We'll get into it further when we get into the demo part. With that, I think we can proceed and go ahead and learn about common routing tasks. Now, this command here actually uses Angular CLI. The first step is to generate an application with routing enabled. So, Angular CLI is used to generate a basic Angular application with application routing module called app routing module. This is basically an ng module where you configure your routes. This is basically your ng module. Now, the next step in generating an application is to add components for routing. So let's see how we can do that. To use the Angular router, an application needs to have at least two components so that you can actually navigate from one to another. To create component using Angular CLI, you need to enter these comments. The first one being ng generate component first for your first component, and second for your second component. Next, we are importing new components in generating a new application. For that, these comments come in handy. So to use new components, we need to import them from app routing module, which is of course at the top of your file. With that said, actually there are many more steps involved in common routing tasks, like defining a basic route. For starters, there are three fundamental building blocks to create a route. So in Angular CLI actually performs step by step for you. However, if you're creating an application manually or working with existing non-CLI application, make sure you verify the imports and configure if all of them are correct. Now, getting route information. So often what happens is user navigates your application. Now, when you want to pass information from one component to another, this basically happens. So for example, consider an application that displays a shopping list for your grocery items. So each item in the list has a unique ID, right? To edit an item, user clicks on edit button. Now, this will open something called as edit grocery component. So you can actually, if you want, retrieve this ID from this component for your grocery item so that it can display the right information to the user. Now, we will take a look at it in our demonstration. Going ahead, we have setting up wildcard routes. Now, a well-functioning application should gracefully handle when users attempt to navigate to part of your application. Like, this does not happen normally. So to add to this functionality, your application should be set up in a wildcard route. This means the Angular router selects this route anytime the requested URL doesn't match any route paths. Next, we have displaying a 404 pages. So to display a 404, you need to set up a wildcard with component property. And to set this, you can actually use 404 pages displaying methods, like the traditional methods itself. And then we have using relative paths. So basically, relative paths, what it'll do is it'll allow you to define paths that are, relative to current URL segment. So the first component and second component are at same level here in the tree. As we saw, we created two components, right? With that, they will be in the same level. However, the second component is situated within the first component because obviously you create the first component first and the second component definitely has to be located inside. Meaning the router has to go up a level and then into a second directory to find the second component. So this is where your relative paths will come into picture. Now you also have something called as choosing a routing category. Like, you should make sure that you choose a routing strategy early in your development of your project because once the application is in production, visitors to your site use and depend only on application URL references. I think next we can go ahead and see how single page application routing techniques works. So in order to understand single page app routing techniques, we need to create an application And following, we'll be seeing the techniques for creating this application and the steps to create them. And the first one is creating a sample application. So to create a sample application, we need to create an Angular project called Angular Routing Sample, or anything as you may wish. But here, let's say we create an application called Angular Router Sample. The next command we need to be using is generating a component, where we need to create a component. Now for that, I have used a component name as crisis list. Next component name I have used as heroes list, and then we use ngserve in order to see our compilation and output. Now again, the steps here is theoretically explained. I will get into the practical part and the demonstration in our demonstration section. Now next we have defining the routes. Here basically what we do is, from our code editor we open app module ts TypeScript file, and then we locate at ng module section and we type the following comments here. Next, on updating the components, we search app.component.html and then we give our router outlet tag. Now this is a directive, just so I mention here. Next, moving on, we have control navigation with UI elements. Here again, in app.component.html, we create a tag in app.component.html and we add these following HTML components. Both are the button tags, as you can see. And next we have app.component.css file. Here we go to the CSS file and add these code lines. So we'll get into the demonstration part, and here we can get a thorough look at what we are doing. Next, in order to identify the active routes, from our code editor, again, we need to open app.component.html and then give the following tags. We also need to update our anchor tag in order to include router link active directive. Now here, a router link active directive is a particular directive, just to mention again. Next, we'll see how we can actually add 404 page. So in order to add 404 page, as we discussed that we should be doing this, we can actually give this command known as ng generate component to generate our page not found. When we do that, we'll find one such page. Now finally, we have reached our final section of today's session, that is a router reference. So here, the first thing that we have is router imports. So in order to make sure that we import our router services in our Angular application, we need to make sure that we give this particular command. So basically, the Angular router is an optional service, and that again presents a particular component view for our given URL. Now it is not part of Angular core. That's why it's in its own library package. That's why you're supposed to be using @angular/router. Now next, in order to configure, there is a bunch of code structure that you have to follow. So basically, a rooted Angular application has one singleton instance of router service. Now, when the browser URL changes, the router looks for corresponding route from which it can actually determine the component to display. Next, speaking of router outlet, like I've mentioned before, it is a directive from a router library that is used like a component. Now it acts as a placeholder that marks the spot in the template where the router should display the components for that particular outlet. Now, speaking of router events, there are actually several events for us to know. During each navigation, the router emits the navigation events through router event property. These events range from when navigation starts to navigation ending. Now, there are many more points in between. Some of them, again, like I said, start of the navigation and cancel or end of the navigation. There is navigational error, root config load start or load end. Again, there are a couple of more events that you can look up for. With that said, let's dive into the demonstration part. Now for the demonstration, I'm going to consider Visual Studio Code here. So firstly, what I'm going to have to do to start with our routing project is we need to generate a routing project. For that, I'm going to take terminal, and in a new terminal, I'm going to say this command where it goes like ng new and any project name that you're creating. Now say I will create a project name called Angular Routing. You can select any name that you want. With this, I'm going to have to give a command -- routing, indicating that this is a routing project. Now I say enter. Now this might take a while to create a project as there are too many packages to be installed. Now when this project is created, we have to dive into the next part. But before that, as you can see, it is asking for the styling sheet that you want to choose. You can choose anything that you want. I'll say CSS, and when I say enter, it's going to start with installing all the packages and creating our project. Now once the project is being created, as you can see, it says the project is being created. Now let's open the folder. We have Angular Routing Demo. The folder is right here. And once you do this, let's go into the source code, app. As you can see, there is a folder created called app routing module TypeScript file. And then you have HTML component file, all sorts of file, which we'll get into later. The first step here, what you're supposed to do is, you're supposed to go into index.html. And once you go here, as you can see, you have title being created called Angular Routing Demo. Let's make it a little visible. Now, once you have done that, the base tag should be mentioned with href. Now, let's get into the app routing module TypeScript file. Now, let me save this before I do that. Here, as you can see, it contains the routing module for our application. And this is where we have to configure our routes for our application. Here we're supposed to make sure that we have imported our Angular core and our routing module. Now with that, we can step into the next step, that is we're supposed to look into the module TypeScript file. Here we have to make sure that a routing module is being imported with our routing module file. And then as you can see, there is an ng module, and also declaration should be made for our app routing module. As we have imported our routing module, the declaration should also be made. Now with that, we have generated a routing project. The next step is generating component in our routing project. Now to generate a new component, we're supposed to consider a following comment. But before that, let's get into our directory that we have just now created. Now, you might take a long time to type such huge project name, so you can create a easier one. So we have gotten into our directory. Now let's go ahead and create our component. The command is ng. G is for generate. You can actually write generate as I've mentioned in the PPT earlier. And here I'm going to consider C, that is for component. Again, you can use component instead of C. And then I'm just going to give an example list or component. You can again consider anything you want. And the command goes like -it, that is for inline text, and -is, that is for inline style. I say enter. A component is being created. Also, similarly, you're supposed to create one more component. I say teacher list. So an example again, inline style, and say enter. Our components have been created. Also, make sure you import your components here. Now that we've created the components, let's go ahead and configure our routes for our application. So to configure our routes, we're supposed to get into this file, routing.module. It's a TypeScript file. So here, all the routes used in this application are actually called here. And in each route, it is actually considered as an object. So basically, each route is considered as object. And so I'm going to go ahead and create an object style. Since this is an object, let's go ahead and create this. Also, you have to remember there is a path present in the URL for this particular object because we need our routers to redirect through this path or via this path. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say path colon and students, since I have said student list, and there is also component for this. And the component is because you need to render this particular component that you have just created over here. So I'm going to say component colon our student list. Here you go. It's a student list component. Now this is for students. Creating for teachers, the same thing, path. I say teachers component, and again here teacher list component. Once this is done, save it. And now also with this, you have to go ahead and mention the same even as your import. Doing this, we will actually create redundancy as it is present in both app module and also in our routing module. So now here, since we have created in both routing module file and app module file, I don't want it to be here in app module. So I'm going to create an export class over here. I just say export const because I'm calling this particular constant routing components, and I create an array over here. So here, if I create an array, both these things will be called inside. So I say student list component, and we have our teacher list component. I say save. Now let's go ahead and import it. That should be done in our app module TypeScript file. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to import my routing components, which I've just declared. I save this and I have to remove this since I have declared it already there. And here, just going to say routing components. Save. Doing this, it is a really good practice as redundancy will be avoided and you don't have to going on creating components here as well as here. So you just can go ahead and create an array of components here and just mention our routing components, which will be a good practice. Now to display the view in routing, we need to open this file. It is an app HTML file which has some redundant code. Let's not consider about that. Let's go ahead. And this tag, router outlet tag, helps us display our output. Now, we have to make sure that this is always there. So let's just remove this unwanted code. We just don't want all these now. Now, this will be created as soon as you create a new application. So I'll just say this, and let's create a normal HTML tag to display our routing output. I'll say style. And I say one heading tag maybe. This is called routing tutorial. Just maintain the code. I say save. And once I save, just come to your command prompt and say npm start. And once you do that, you can go ahead and look into your local host 4200, you'll see our output. So let's see if this is configured. So since this is still compiling, let's wait and see if the local host will work. Now, since the configuration and the compilation is all done, as you can see, our routing tutorial is being displayed. Now, in order to jump into our students and teachers list that we just created, I'm just going to have to say students. I say enter. It says student list work. And instead of that, I say teachers. It says teacher works. But obviously, the user cannot type the URL. Hence, let's go ahead and add the buttons over here into our HTML file. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an anchor tag. So let's say navigation, because I need our user to be navigated. And inside navigation, I create an anchor tag. Now here, what I'm going to do is I need to relink our student URL into a button. So for that, I'm just going to say router link, which will say that our students must be linked into a button. So I'm just going to go ahead and add a button over here. I say button. Now this will keep it enabled. We want our student to be displayed here. And similarly, I say router link for our teachers. I close the tag. And once I have finished this, adding anchor and button tags, I'll just save. Let's go ahead and see this. As you can see, clicking on this buttons, this works. Now, this is what we do in our routing tutorial. We can also do this in our existing application. We can implement it, we can modify it, but this is the basic works of all the routing tutorial here. I hope this was useful. Now, with that, this will bring us to the end of today's session. Now, I hope that was useful and you learned something about routing and navigation today. This will bring us to the end of today's session. I hope this video was useful, and until we meet again, happy learning.
I hope you have enjoyed listening to this video. Please be kind enough to like it, and you can comment any of your doubts and queries, and we will reply them at the earliest. Do look out for more videos in our playlist and subscribe to Edureka channel to learn more. Happy learning!